Mr. Bison Flips!
Mr. Bison Flips! Mr. Bison Flips! Mr. Bison Flips!
Welcome to this video continuing our lecture series on the IB examination coming up very soon. Today we're going to talk about paper 2 and specifically the types of questions that you might expect in the paper 2 examination. As you know, paper 2 examines part 3 of the literature course, which is literary genres. This is where you demonstrate how well you have come to understand a particular genre of text during your studies. So whether your class is focused on purely on drama or on novels or on poetry or non-fiction text, this is where you get to show that you really understand how that text genre operates and how it differs from other types of text. So it's really important, I think, that you at this stage have come up with your own definition of what does this genre actually mean. What does it mean to be, what does it mean that a particular text is a novel as opposed to a short story? And when you've thought about that definition, then think about what are the techniques that are typical that make up this genre? What do writers of this particular text type do to show that they're writing in this genre? And then find examples of this in your particular texts. And once you've done that, then you can start grouping ideas and planning essays. So you more or less have essays ready depending on which of your definitions the question will be focusing on. So as an example, I'll talk about poetry today because poetry is what I've taught most recently with my students. So to me, poetry has three characteristics that distinguish it from other types of text. First of all, it's concise. Poetry is usually not very long. It's usually quite concise and to the point, much more compressed than other form of fiction or prose writing. Secondly, poetry has rhythm. It doesn't have to be constant, a strong beat, or a strong rhyme scheme, or a clear meter, but there's always a sense of a rhythmical movement. Even if it's a free verse poem, there's still a sense of rhythm pushing the poetry forward. And lastly, poetry tends to deal with intense personal experiences, often emotional experiences, where the poet explores some aspect of not necessarily his or her own life, but at least a character that's dealing with an intense personal emotional experience. So what I suggest you do next is what I have done here. You take those definitions that you've got, so in my case, conciseness, rhythm, and intense personal experiences, and then you list all those techniques that you think make up this genre. What are the techniques used by poets? And try to group them under these headings. So for instance, what makes poetry concise? Well, it's the fact that you can work with ambiguity. It's really important to use the form. In order to shorten sentences, poetry relies heavily on imagery, metaphors, similes, other forms of compression, a lot of allusions and connotations coming with particular choice of diction. It uses anaphora, epiphora, etc. to really compress the writing. Secondly, the rhythm aspect. So how do we create that rhythm? Well, you can do that in many ways. You can use enjambment, control the line length of the poetry, and change the syntax around to make things more flexible. And obviously the more obvious things will be things like rhyme and meter, and traditional sound devices like onomatopoeia, assonance, alliteration, different types of alliteration, fricatives and sibilants, plosive sounds and sonorants, all shape the sound and the rhythm of a poem. And lastly, the personal experience. What is it that makes the poetry feel intensely personal? Well, obviously the subject matter is going to be personal, but also obviously tone and mood. Poetry can often be satirical or even humorous. The characters are quite prominent. If the poet does use characters, they tend to be quite prominent. The voice of the persona and the speaker is often clear, and we use mixed senses in synesthesia, different types of imagery, and sometimes there's a plot that drives that personal experience. So they are the techniques that I think make up the core of poetry. So the next step then is to make an essay plan for each of your definitions. So in my case, I would have 3 different essay plans. I would have one essay in case the question is something along the lines of why is poetry so concise? I would have one essay that's more or less clear if the question is how reliant is poetry on rhythm, and then a third essay ready in case the question is why is the subject matter of poetry often about personal experiences. That allows me to tackle the genre from 3 different angles. And as long as you then have examples from at least 2 of your poets and several poems there, so say a handful of poems at most, out of the 60 or so you've studied, then you're prepared for that, for those 3 types of essays. And since the question is going to be about genre, you're more than likely to be able to answer at least one of the questions in the examination. So to double check yourself, go over past questions, look over past exams, and see with your revised plan, can you respond to at least 2 of the 3 questions in the past papers? If you can't, if you feel actually, you know what, this doesn't work with my definition, then maybe you need to widen your definition or narrow your definition so it suits better what the markers seem to think, or the question setters seem to think that your particular genre is about. There's usually 1 or 2 questions in the exam that's sort of wildcard questions that you can't really prepare for. Sometimes you'll get lucky and that's going to suit your poetry or your text perfectly. But my experience is that for the most part, these questions will not work all that well for most texts. Say, for instance, you've not really done any humorous poets and the question is all about humor in poetry, then that's probably not going to work for you unless you're lucky enough to have some poets that work with humor or work as a contrast to a humorous poet. So if the wildcard questions don't work for you, don't worry about that. Make sure that one of the others suits you better. Hopefully this video has helped you to find an avenue into the examination and made you realize how easy it is actually to prepare. Even though you're not pre-preparing essays, you're preparing plans for the different types of questions that could come in relation to your genre. If you need any further help with this, obviously post comments below or send me a message, and we'll see if I can help you further develop your plans to make sure that you are successful in the easiest exam in the IB diploma.